Greetings, Zer0 Book readers. I'm excited to bring to you this conversation with Dr. Ben Woodard, author with Zer0 Books of the excellent Slime Dynamics, Generation, Mutation, and the Creep of Life, and contributor to the Zer0 Books anthology, Melanchology, Black Metal Theory and Ecology. Ben began his academic career as a contributor to the speculative realist movement in continental philosophy. Today, his approach to philosophy is guided closely by his naturalistic reading of the German idealist philosopher F.W.J. Schelling, as he intervenes in debates in the philosophy of biology and what he terms Cthulhuid ethics. Today, we are also joined by Adam from Acid Horizon, who is completing his PhD on 19th century German philosophy and is a long-term reader of Schelling. Ben, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today.
No, thanks for having me.
Anyone approaching your book, Slime Dynamics, from 2012, is likely to be immediately surprised by some of its central themes, which you term the sliminess of night, the sliminess of life, and dark vitalism. What was it that brought you to these themes, and what's their significance?
Yeah, so I guess in part it's my relationship to writing or philosophy has always been partly through junk culture, through sort of science fiction and horror, and sort of how concepts are deployed in fictional realms, for instance. And so there's sort of that on the one side, then the fact that I've been interested in biology or things about life and the kind of materiality of life for a long time. Yeah, even since I was quite young. And so I think for me, the Slime Dynamics was a way to sort of point to the philosophical problem by using sort of very unphilosophical stuff to do it. And so the notion being that looking at kind of junky, trashy stuff kind of makes a sort of negative picture of the concepts at work in a way. And I'm sure in part it's also a bit my own, I don't know, proto-goth gen personality or whatever that is. And that certainly affected the kind of choices I made in terms of materials, I'm sure. And so the other aspect of this is the fact that, the whole life as a philosophical problem in philosophy became more and more a life kind of took on this phenomenological quality, this kind of rosy pictured a kind of eminence or pseudo-theological or phenomenological kind of exuberance. And so using the kind of materials I did in the book was a way to kind of push back against that in a way. But yeah, and so dark vitalism was just a shorthand or sort of shorthand way to kind of name that, whatever that was, this idea that life could be productive and sort of producing and like overflowing, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing. I mean, it could also be very disgusting. The question is, what does that do to the concept of life in philosophy? Yeah, and I think otherwise it's kind of a more general trajectory of how I got into philosophy, which was sort of backwards temporally from Deleuze. And this is where a lot of the interest in like life and non-living and living stuff, and then through Lacan and then Zizek and Badiou. And then eventually that led me to Schelling and to German views. So yeah, so I sort of went backwards. I went from the 1960s more or less to the 1800s. And yeah, the book was a way to try to make that kind of trajectory make sense to people who don't necessarily have a philosophical background.
One of the things I really liked about reading this book was how it takes apart sort of the key components that we think about as of even the word biology. So we have bios, life, and logos, account, and the idea of the logos as being so entwined with intellectualism, with thought, and with something that distinguishes life from biology, life from our account of it, our science of it, which is always presented as a very human endeavor, and of course always theologized in terms of intelligence. What I really liked about this book was how it problematizes notions of swarms and slimes and the slime mold creatures they can use. They've used in some Japanese experiments to do city planning, about the idea that intelligence, you can have the results of intelligence emerge without intelligence, so to speak. And it seems like overall there's a kind of a very much a strong decentralizing of the human in how you talk about biology in your work. So I want to ask about what was the sort of motivation for trying to decenter the human here, and how you think that would speak to what biology ends up being in general. Because obviously one thinks of philosophy of biology, there's a very temptation to think of bioethics or to think of the real Dark Lord, someone like Peter Singer or something like that. And I think some people may have an association with biopolitics, or particularly the political applications of biology within this reified human form as how do we govern human bodies, which are the special bodies, of course. I want to ask you where this, how this de-anthropomorphization or decentering of the human would function in your work in terms of breaking apart the biology, the bios from its logos.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. One of the aspects is the fact that the simple fact, which, well, not simple fact, but sort of the weird fact, which is in part inspired by Schelling, is how the thinking of life is not the history of life, right? That seems kind of obvious based on how long it took for human brains to emerge, right? We have a rough estimate when that happened or what like brains happened. And so we know an awful lot of time passed, an awful lot of forms of life came to be and went extinct. Meanwhile, and so immediately there's this backlog, right, of sort of all the things life did in order to get to the point where you have something that we want to call human cognition or even cognition in general. And then, of course, being social animals and being the animals that sort of export our intelligence in forms of narratives and myths and stories, there's going to be a lot of back projecting or back reading. Right, which even this is a phrase that Stephen Jay Gould used all the time. Whenever people said evolution is progress, you get really annoyed and say, like, no, you're late. That's a very human way, right? That's a way to recenter the human. Ask for Darwin. To say, oh, well, it's the march of progress. This famous picture going from Neanderthals to other forms of Homo to Homo sapien. And so there's, of course, the ethical dimension, which we could talk about later. But there's also the naturalistic dimension, in the sense that, look, if you know that it took this long to get cognition, there's probably a lot of artifacts and weird slapped together kind of kludgy systems which made cognition happen. And then, of course, we're inside cognition. So even there, we have a limited view of viewing it in its own terms only, right? And so biology, in part, is about, by looking at the possibility of the emergence of intelligence in other systems, we can start to sort of unwind, sort of untie a lot of the assumptions built in to the sort of road to cognition, right? And if the road of cognition is as contingent as some people have thought, again, Gould, but many others, then you have to take stock of what those contingencies mean for an intelligence that emerged contingently to then think its own past logically. So that makes the logos part of the equation much more sketchy, which isn't to say that we can't learn anything. We can't, of course, but it's like there's always this strong urge, right, to recenter the human. And even immediately after publication of The Origin of Species, people were trying to sort of shove teleology back in like dozens of different ways. And so the fact that that always happens with biology, I think, is something you have to be very aware of. And so it's not just an ethical, political reason to sort of ecological reason to do that, but it also just gives us a false picture of the human. And it makes any picturing or story of the general human, like the human animal, basically impossible if we're constantly back reading and so retrojecting a certain form of purposefulness back. And so, yeah, to sort of do justice to the bios, you kind of have to, I think, do a genealogy of the logos bit. That makes sense.
While I was reading through Slime Dynamics, there was an example that I couldn't stop thinking about that I think relates directly to this point of discussion. I mean, anyone approaching your books for the first time is likely going to be impressed by the wide range of cultural references that you draw upon, from horror authors like Lovecraft and Ligotti to famous film franchises like Star Wars and Alien, to video game series like StarCraft and Gears of War. As I was reading through Slime Dynamics, there was one specific cultural cultural artifact that was really at the front of my mind, and that was the Resident Evil franchise, especially just in its latest iteration, the latest iteration of the virus in it. Of course, what you say about, thinking life beyond the human. In Resident Evil, it provides us a certain medium for thinking about that through the form of the virus. right? You have this evil genius character, Albert Wesker, who's trying to produce this ultimate virus that'll create a life form that will supersede and supplant humanity. And then you have this other character, Albert Wesker, who gets infected by one of the viruses and then undergoes this period of rapid evolution, at the final point of which he's nothing resembling the human as an ultimate life form per se. It's just sort of a giant slimy eyeball at the back of a train. But also in the latest iteration of the Resident Evil franchise, the vector of life, the vector of the transformation of life, changes from its viroid form to being slime mold, which infests the main character, and he becomes a kind of mold being capable of regrowing hands that have been bitten off. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the Resident Evil franchise and this change in it and how life is thought in it, and maybe also in other prominent sci-fi and horror.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the reason why, I mean, this is again sort of mixed a couple of things, because it's again my sort of lifelong love of horror film. Like I remember I watched the first two Alien movies. I would record them off of TV and then watch them until they broke, until the tapes, the VHS stuff. I was already like addicted very early on. I mean, I think, part of the thing that's fascinating about them in terms of biology, and again, this sort of the different functions of how horror works and how science fiction works, and sort of how horror sci-fi or would be my sort of ultimate genre, but it doesn't work a lot of the time. I think people don't try to do it so often, more so in video games probably than it. But I think part of it is that it's like they both deal with extrapolating from the known and unknown different ways. And so for science fiction, both are about like other forms of life. But of course, with horror, you're more likely to have, not necessarily, but more likely, you have some extrapolation from various discoveries, or the kinds of fears and anxieties are going to change now and then based on the type of disease, right? The shift from even thinking things about plague versus infection versus the virus versus fungal, right? The kinds of aesthetics and speeds and the kind of cultural forms that are attached to them based on, I think when you say plague, most people probably have a medieval kind of picture that emerges when you say virus. Of course, it's a much more contemporary, obviously, because of the discovery of viral forms. It's a very 20th century kind of association, even though, of course, they existed before, right? So again, you have this kind of strange time lag. But I think I think what horror does is interesting is, of course, the science fiction. So much of it assumes or rides upon the notion, right, that there's lots of life there's lots of alien life, right? Not all science fiction, of course, but a lot of it means, okay, the cosmos is not empty. There's lots of forms of life out there. And of course, that's a very old idea. That notion is a theological one in the sense of the principle of plenitude. This idea that the universe must be filled with life, because why would you have all these planets and not have life? That would be a silly thing for God to do. It would seem very wasteful if the cosmos wasn't full. Whereas, of course, horror is very much, because it's based upon the sort of reemergence of the past in various ways. And so I think what's interesting about when they come together in something like Resident Evil, or even in the book, I think I mentioned Parasite Eve is a particularly interesting case of this, right? Because it's using our evolutionary history to kind of create a kind of extreme explosion of life. So instead of having the principle of plenitude, right, that there's all kinds of aliens out there, or the more strict thing of horror being there's kind of ancient and dead or not quite dead creatures, you sort of have this interesting mix of the two where the principle of plenitude goes inside the human, right? So you have the kind of infection, overgrowing form of life, kind of uncontrolled emergence, self-organization of the viral, right? This kind of runaway notion of life is kind of horrific in itself and transformative, yet also inseparable from us, right? From our very basic capacities to exist, right? There's no closing off the barriers, right? We're sort of always infected, and our guts have insane amounts of bacteria in them. And so I think it plays on, it's a mix of this, like life is everywhere in science fiction, and there's no safe distance at the same time in horror. And so that's why I think Resident Evil plays on that. And it also, of course, changes with the time. I suggest, like, I think there's probably more people into fungal things in the last 10, 20 years than I have been in a long time. I would be willing to guess, partially because of, what Adam mentioned, like with the urban planning experiments where they solve what's called the traveling salesman problem, right? Like if you have to go to all these places, what's the most efficient way to put the hub so that and then of course the fungus just grows most efficiently to get the sugar or whatever. And then you have a really efficient subway map, right? And the central station should be, the hubs should be. And so, and that with, of course, sort of returning to psychedelia and psychedelics and psilocybin and this stuff being used again. And then with the kind of manufacturing of mushrooms as a kind of business in the last 10 years, I think it's probably no coincidence that now the horror is also going to be more and more fun, which we've seen a bit in film as well with The Girl with All the Gifts, for instance, or The Last of Us video games, or this kind of thing. But yeah, I think there's a kind of turning inward of the alien that also plays on these ecological alliances we have with other beings as well.
I think that's incredibly important to bring up, especially thinking about, I'm going to bring up a lot of etymology here. This is I know I'm being far too German about this, but even the idea of going back to the idea of immunity, the immunus, the thing that is not essentially the opposite of the common, the community. When you say that the principle of plenitude goes in, it is kind of the infection is an invasion of immunity. It's an invasion of the thing where we see our sort of separation from wider forms of biological life, even as really beyond our sort of cognitive presentation of ourselves as this self-contained I think, embodied I think, but the I think is still always floating above it from Descartes to Kant onwards. And it does actually, I do like kind of de-amplify, taking out the center of the human really does open up a kind of it will ultimately have political and ethical implications of being in community with other beings. And I think the fungal is a really good example of this. I mean, in horror as well, one of my favorite films the last few years is Ben Wheatley's In the Earth, which is, just as listeners, it's an amazing film. It's basically set in a time in which COVID is happening, but much worse. And if people go into these woods and they essentially meet two different people trying to commune with a giant mycorrhizal fungal network, which is also trying to communicate with them. And it's not quite human, but you don't actually see its perspective. You just see trees. You just see noise. You hear noise, and you see spores floating about and the like. And I think the implications of this for a decentering of the human life is both very scary and very promising, because then you have this both communal aspect and you have the ideas. The fungal aspect is also very scary because spores are these invisible, semi-invisible kind of things, omnipresent. But at the same time, they will all digest our bodies and we go into the ground, if we are so inclined to going into the ground, fair enough. But at the same time, they're also, as it's described in the Earth, it's a giant brain. It's a giant communicative node. It's the systems theory which our entire societies are ideally looking to produce through methods of human intelligence. And yet, if you subtract the cognitive dimension of human intelligence, we can still, the results are still emergent. And it seems, maybe we can do like mycorrhizal analysis, going to the Earth and thinking about how maybe we're not as conscious as our societies than we'd like to be. But I just wanted to ask you can expand on the fungal a little bit, because one of the principal elements of slime dynamics is how you're responding to Schelling's critique of vitalism, the idea that it can't just be one vital force. Because for Schelling, everything is dynamic. Forces have to be attracting and repelling in relation to a third power, a third potency. But you're talking about how thinking about vitalism doesn't have to be about this object X, this X force, which is the motive force, to go to a term from Warhammer 40,000. So it's more in the sense of time is being the motive force. Time as one of the main forces in relation to space and this, as you call it, the dark ground, to use Schelling's term, about this fundamental speculative mass of excess which precedes all of the world as we see it developing. So I just wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit upon how not only how time works in relation to fungal, to what you call the creep of life, but also how time overall works as a generative force in this wider system of, or wider speculative dynamic of life as you're working on it.
Yeah, I think the fungal chapter in the book was it was a bit challenging because I had to talk about the more abstract notions in Schelling, because he doesn't really talk about fungus that I can remember. And so this is why this critique of vitalism made sense as a sort of way to sort of do it with Schelling, because, like you say, that his critique of vitalism is basically one force can't do everything. That's not how forces work. Right. So it just doesn't make sense to say a force is producing all life, because then there also would be no action on the part of the life forms to sustain themselves, right? So there has to be some more complex relation to the activity and passivity of the organisms being. We often talk about organisms like persistent chemical reactions, right? Like the sort of whirlpool imagery, right? Then of course with the whirlpool, right, that kind of gives you a really high energy kind of dynamic picture, which makes a lot of sense, especially for like for mammals, for instance, or birds. Right? It's like, yeah, you can see organisms or us, right, as kind of these frantic, like jittery bags of chemicals that have to steal energy from the environment in order not to collapse, right? But again, with fungus, right, like they just seem so slow and so inactive. And like you said, like pointing to the Wheatley movie, right? We don't see most of it, right? There's a gigantic fungus that's older than Christ in the Northwest United States, which is just like massive. It's like 3 states. It touches 3 states or something. It's just huge. But you would never know, I think, walking across it. So you see its effects and not its structure. But yeah, but the things, and this is sort of where the junk culture thing sort of against what's seen as like a negative space in philosophy makes sense to me, because it's very hard to find a philosopher who says something nice about mushrooms, fungus before 1950, maybe. Like, of course, one quote I use in the book is the Bernstein says, right, like fungus can be afforded children of the vegetable world or something like this. So even as late as the 1920s, I'm just saying all these things are just like failures, or they're just disease. They're just a different form of disease. Well, most people saw them as for a long time. And yeah, so and of course, the big mistake, and this, you already alluded to this, is that plants are, of course, generally seen as more passive and slow, but it seems like mushrooms just they largely do eat the dead. Right? That's their sort of ecological function, most of them, all of them. But the thing is, they're just processors, right? They're like giant distributed processes of information communication between species, right? I mean, if you wanted to generally define fungus, it'd be something like that. Right? They're very old processors in a sense, partially because, as one likely story goes, and this is recounted really nicely in a recent book, Merlin Sheldrake, he wrote this book about sort of fungal world and talks about philosophy like this. But in there, he sort of tells a story of how there's this thought that fungus was largely responsible for making soil. And so the fact that the fungi was some of the first stuff that came on land and was able to break down sort of rockiness and the mineralization of sort of old ancient earth, and eventually make it possible for plants, which of course then eventually made possible else. But of course, that obviously this kind of ungrounding function would have been very nice, I think, for Schelling. Maybe he was aesthetically or for some other reasons not willing to go with fungus in that way. But yeah, this sort of ungrounding function is also what allows for that sort of connective function, right? The fact that they can kind of feel made for ground means they have laid a lot of wire, if you want to say, or they've made a lot of electrochemical connections between tree roots, right? Which people mention this all the time, right? That fungi allow trees to warn each other faster than their normal systems. It has to, like pheromone release, and sort of telling their neighbor trees, like, hey, there's a drought coming, like, save up, this kind of stuff. But yeah, I think it's a good case of how aesthetic biases can be just so strong that you just think something is not worth thinking about. And even someone like Schelling, he thinks he wouldn't do that. Right? He sort of fell victim to that in a way.
Well, I think so far we've kind of been skirting around one of the central concerns of your turn towards fungal thoughts, or what the contemporary Heideggerian phenomenologist Michael Martyr calls a vegetal being or vegetal thinking, which is the ethical dimension of it. In Slime Dynamics, you introduce this distinction. I think you get it from Nagaristani, between being open and being opened, or being ripped open or being splayed open. Maybe just aesthetically, I think that's a very macabre, but also for that reason, very intriguing image. It makes me think also of, say, Tom Sparrow's work on Lebanon Chain, where the encounter with the other, the possibility of ethical living originates in not some gesture or action that transpires within the realm or domain of the self, but in an instant where you're forced outside or pushed outside or pulled outside into a territory in which you're utterly alien and unfamiliar. In that kind of context, ethical living and ethical being become this matter of learning how to navigate and live within a foreign territory. It's a kind of anti-ethics, right? A learning how to live with another and learning how to live as another. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, again, this ethical dimension, maybe not just in slime dynamics, but also in your other work as well, because I know you have all this stuff on Schelling. I'm not familiar, at least not terribly familiar, with Schelling's views on ethics either.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think, I'll just start with the slime that I was thinking, move on to Schelling. Because there I'm mostly talking about Reza, particularly this part of Cyclonopedia, which is, what you mentioned, is called good meal. Right? In the sense of like you make yourself about being open versus being open to, right? Or the other way he defines it as openness versus real openness, as opposed to affordance, right? So in like the phenomenological sense, or in a lot of the senses, when people talk about openness or an ethical stance towards the other, Reza critiques that as being, that's just affordance, right? It's like, I'm open to you to the degree that I can afford to be, right? So I'm not radically open to you. I'm open to that I accept you. Don't make a mess on the furniture. Like, yes, you can stay here, but okay, that's long enough. I mean, I think they're being a bit facetious, but not totally, right? It's like that. It's like a stance that has a limit, but the limit is decided by you, who has been open. So it's like, that's not really being open in the way that Reza means when he talks about radical openness, means both, right? That you might be destroyed by whatever you encounter. Right? You might be destroyed, but you can be open and then you get eat. That's the base. Like, if you try to say, I'm only going to be open to this extent beforehand, then you're not actually being open, right? You're just saying, well, I can afford to be open-ish. And of course, the other aspect of that is the status of the stance of openness. So you can sort of say, well, I'm open, right? And then sort of limit your encounters with things. Or you can seek out in a kind of acceleration, sort of radical way, right? Like, I'm going to just go as extreme as I can and see what happens, right? That's another way of being open. But then there's also the kind of another strategy, which is what he emphasizes in the book, with this idea of making yourself a good meal. Right, the idea is that if you kind of lock yourself in, or if you make yourself into an enigma or a kind of shelved entity, then you are inviting only the most curious things to come look for you. Right. So it's also about, there's this whole predator-prey kind of dynamic that's also in the back of this, right? It's how being open doesn't mean, hello, everybody, right? Being open can also, radically open can also be like, everyone leave me alone, I'm going to be over there. Right. So it's like, it's still an invitation, but it takes a very different form, right? Because it's trying to make openness a kind of work rather than a sort of seemingly straightforward stance. So with that in mind, what's interesting to me and in Schelling is that a lot of people have picked up on this, of this sort of the potentially ethical dimensions in there, is that, of course, he says already 1809 that nature is no longer a subject for philosophy. So he says nature as like something that is important for philosophy just starts to disappear after modern philosophy. So he really thinks post Descartes, he thinks nature doesn't exist for philosophy, not a philosophical subject anymore. Right? So, which has interesting consequences. And then also at the same time, we're very much, and this is this grounding logic in Schelling, which has an ethical dimension, because, right, we're grounded in nature. I'll say things like nature thinks through me. Right? So this kind of attaches to this openness, there's certain different forms of radical openness, in that we can't even make a clear cut between us and nature. Right? Everything we're doing is going to be entangled with it in some way. And no form of rationality is going to be able to cut its sort of strings to nature. It's more this issue of stance, right? It's like, to what degree do you appeal to nature as a productive force, like Schelling does, in order to explain the content of my head right now? Right? So when he says things like nature thinks in me, or we think according to nature, it doesn't mean we know what nature wants, that nature is a conscious being per se, but that all of its processes and materials are involved in the production of cognition, right? At every moment, right? The air we're breathing, what we've eaten, right? The state our bodies are in, all these types of things. And so I think there's a similar kind of stance. You can't really just say, I'm one with nature, right? Schelling thinks like, no, that's bull. Like you can't. Like he says, I think it's in the introduction to the ideas for philosophy of nature, I think, which is there are no natural sons of freedom. So it's like nobody just is free by existing, or nobody just is like understands nature by being part of it. Being a part of something doesn't mean you can speak to all of it. And that's kind of that's sort of the big ethical stance, I think, for Schelling, is that it's like, well, everything you do is potentially creative and destructive. So how do you like justify or not justify doing in any kind of sense? And I think the closest he gets, and this, Ian Hamilton Grant has noted this and kind of suggested this, but he hasn't really written about Schelling's ethics explicitly, but what he's kind of implied is that if there's an ethics in Schelling, it's an ethics of this kind of non-separability. It's that you sort of have to see your actions as always being a part of nature, but without knowing nature. And so the best you can do is try to maximize and not destroy the creative potencies in nature that you are aware of. And so this is also why Schelling emphasizes things like intuition, which a lot of people don't like. I think he's being mystical or being kind of off the rails in terms of being an idealist and so on. But to him, intuition isn't this like magical, there's many forms, and it's not necessarily this magical thing where you just get something immediately. Very often, intuition, again, the translation is even trickier. Intuition is about a kind of immediate awareness of one's capacities in this place, right? It's like, what can you do with what you have now? Right. So this is the kind of ethical stance, while keeping in the back of your mind that everything is, there's a sort of continuum that works. But you can't know or see the continuum at all times. So it's sort of like, okay, what can be done without destroying nature's capacities that are in front of you? Which I think a lot of people don't find particularly satisfactory. It's not very prescriptive. But I think for him, like, you can't do much better at the same time. So it's a bit frustrating.
We're not going to get a kind of a transhumanist Schelling. We're going to get sort of or even a post-humanist Schelling, but a pre-humanist liberation from the theological confines of this transcendental I floating about. And one of my things I love most about Schelling's nature philosophy, it's also, I think, very much ties into how you're working speculative realism as well. I think we've talked about this before the show, about how Schelling's project is, because he's going against, he said, it's back reading, this retrospective going back into things in the way that a lot of philosophers have done it. So Kant eventually returns to nature, in a sense. He does his metaphysical foundation of natural science, and he does his anthropology, which is basically going, okay, so we have these coordinates of cognition which allow us to understand the world, but pre-built in us, which we've deduced by going back. So what are the necessary conditions of us getting these objects as they actually are, or as they appear to us, logically speaking? And then he turns to do the same thing in nature and ends up just producing like one of the earliest theories of scientific racism, because he's so privileging the cognitive. He's only privileging the cognitive as it can emerge. And similar to Hell's, because it's all going to the same goal, which is the present dominant kind of cognition that they consider to be dominant. What I really like about Schelling is taking things to the unconditioned level, the unconditioned in nature, as he calls, just infinite, not infinite blind productivity, but infinite striving or infinite longing productivity, which is always constantly inhibiting itself and self-inhibiting itself. And this is why you can talk about, is that we're going to do the conditions of possibility for the conditions of possibility. And so I particularly think about the ethical dimension in Schelling. I mean, it's very much good to bring up. It's not prescriptive. It's mainly, it's kind of it's an emancipatory aspect for emancipating you from the fixed idea, I guess, of the human. But one of the terms you use in slime dynamics to talk about the ethical dimension actually is making a distinction between sort of ethics that is so much focused on generating forms of life in terms of their meaning, sort of the Agambenian sense, and something you call a pathological ethics, which is based on sort of thinking about pathology as something that unbinds life from the necessity of it to not simply be matter, but also to matter in the sense of it has to curate prescriptive meanings, or meanings that are very much caught up in this whole theological and dominatory and very much human milieu of meaning. So I don't know if you could explain a bit more about what you mean by sort of pathology in terms of this, because sometimes we think of pathology, we think of like the Freudian diagnosis, and I don't think you're going with the diagnostic sense of pathology here.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it feeds into this sort of productive, this emphasis on creation and production in Schelling. And it's also, I mean, I think it's one of the hardest things about being a Schellinian, if that's the thing you can say, is that how to really account for this. Because on the one hand, people want to push you and say, oh, isn't that just Deleuze? Like, aren't you just like, you're just like this pure productive machine and you're like just happy like producing it. And, part of me was that Deleuze was a bit too rosy. I mean, he talks about some negative effects and things, but I feel like in general, it has a quite like much too chipper kind of, or I would say unrealistic sort of aesthetic dimension. It's of course also very modernist in its aesthetic dimension, which in itself is a problem. If you want to talk about this as a kind of, unthinged or kind of unconditioned, then as soon as you give an example, you've conditioned it, of course. Right. So even if you want to talk about the conditions for the possibility of conditions, right, for possibility, what does that look like in practice? This is why I think it's the hardest thing about Schelling, but it's also why people, I think, or I should say people who do German idealism or scholars of German idealism or German thought can't see his method. I think he has a very bizarre method. It's completely, or not completely, but he's mostly, he's not very forthright about what his method is. And I think that's part of the dilemma, because if you want to talk about the unconditioned, if you want to talk about philosophy in really the most biggest sense, if you want to talk about nature and not like nature as for humans or nature as this dimension, if you want to talk about like how something like dimensionality takes place or how nature itself takes place, it's very hard to I think do that other than in a negative sense, right? Like we can show you instances of life, organisms, or constructions, which exhibit this or that potency or this or that capacity of nature, but none of them really exhibit the unconditioned, because that wouldn't make sense. So that's why he kind of has to do this kind of odd argument when this is also the time and space thing comes in, right? In the first outline, where he says things like, well, there can't be only creation or that there can't be only being and only becoming. There must be like both, right? Like, because if there was just only creation, there wouldn't be stuff. So at one point, Schelling is like, why are there objects? I'm like, why isn't there just like these torrid stream of creation all the time? Or the opposite of that, why isn't existence just like a frozen block or like a permanent perception or something like this? So he kind of thinks, well, we have to be somewhere between those things. But again, it's only a negative proof, right? You can't point to the unconditioned, but that's where then the ethical comes in. And I like to say, this is why he spends so much time, even late into his life, even I know at least as late as the lectures on the history of philosophy, so like 1830s or 1820s. I don't think they even know the date actually exactly. But even there, he sort of says, Kant, doesn't question how these conditions came to be. Like these conditions had to come to be. They couldn't just already be. Nothing can just already be. And so, and again, he has his negative proof, but there's just a cost of it, right? And that's often what Schelling does. And that's, I guess, what he's most ethical and stuff, is where he's saying, well, that might be philosophically sound argument, but these are the costs of that being a philosophically sound argument. And so that's why, again, I think saying what his epistemology is or his ethics is really hard, because he's constantly trying to figure that out. And it's through his critiques of other people mostly, I think. But I'm not sure if that answered everything you asked. I feel like I'm skipping something.
No, I think it's very much important to draw upon, the problem of making an Schillingian method, because he has so many different systems. I mean, he writes the Ideen when he's like 22 or something, and then he writes the first outline, and then we don't have the Weltseele, but not before I do like a whole Schelling bibliography. I think it's very much important to bring out the ambiguity of Schelling, but I think his honesty as a system builder is what I think is good for thinking about this question, because he makes different systems because he wants a different thing every time, whereas Hegel acts if he wants nothing, and there's only been sort of one system, maybe two if you prod him a little bit. And I think leaving that ambiguity there is part of the openness, which any sort of ethics as an orientation rather than as like a set of like laws of how to do life now, I think is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and we mentioned this before, right? That he has this note he writes in his journal where he says, I would never want to make one system because then I would be trapped inside it, basically, right? Like I would then be a part of the system and I wouldn't be a system maker anymore, which already tells you how different he is from Hegel, right? And I think that's a sort of an interesting relationship between them, is that they both think we're sort of already stuck in the problem, right? That there is a kind of monist, or at least a kind of continuum of existence, and that you have to use some method in order to see the parts, right? The problem is to see action or to see perception or to like make the cuts in reality. And this is the hard work. But of course, the way they go about doing it is completely opposite, basically, right? Hegel thinks, well, let's make these incredibly fine, a history of mind. Let's do a history of, right, naturalistic phenomenology, right? Let's make the story that makes this sense. And Schelling's thing is like, no, all you can do is throw paint at the walls, basically. But the paint is like the various systems he makes. That's like, okay, I don't think this one works anymore. The next one. Okay, that one is limited now. Okay, let's go back to this one. Okay, no, let's do this. Let's combine Plato and Aristotle. There's all kinds of wacky stuff. Let's write a novel, philosophical novel. Let's write a Platonic dialogue. Like, his whole mode is just, let's try stuff. But yet he maintains certain conceptual commitments, which makes it interesting, right? It's not like they're totally different. The same figures kind of pop up throughout. So it's like, but the consistency you have to kind of see after the fact, comparatively. It's not like he's saying, here's my system, or this is how I'm going to do this. He's just kind of like, well, let's do a novel now about the spirit world. Okay, that's just how that's how he did it.
Well, I think I'd be remiss, at least, if I, in this interview, didn't ask you about your critique of Deleuze. I think the first of your books that I read was On an Ungrounded Earth. You and I spoke about it briefly on Twitter a couple of years ago, actually. I think you described it as like pulp cultural theory or something like that. I thought it was fantastic. But I wanted to pick up on, in the context of that book and slime dynamics, a couple of the things that you've said about Deleuze. I mean, in On an Ungrounded Earth, like your main target of criticism is this Promethean conception that you see localized in people like Deleuze and Spinoza. And you've just mentioned this, what you call like a rosiness in Deleuze's metaphysics. I think I have a slightly different interpretation of Deleuze than you do then. So this rosiness that you see in his metaphysics. When I read that, what immediately came to mind was A Coldness and Cruelty by Deleuze. There's this line in it where he said, like, everything is sexual. And I think he means that in a similar sense to what Marxists mean when they say everything is political. It's not that everything is just political. Things can also be social and romantic and so on. But for Deleuze, and also for Deleuze and Guattari, the sense in which everything is sexual, at least as I interpret it, is the sense in which anything can be made into kind of the object of a sexual fetish, right? Anything can be appropriated by desire and made into this obscene fetish. So maybe my interpretation of Deleuze in this is closer to Mark Fisher's. In his dissertation, he situates Deleuze in this canon of Gothic materialists, people for whom thinking life is a matter of thinking life as both, in its dimensions of both creativity and destructivity, both its sacredness and its profanity. And I guess this goes on to the heart of my objection to your reading of Deleuze, if it's all right to be offering an objection.
No, of course.
Because you talk a lot On an Ungrounded Earth about this idea of pre-thinkability and unprethinkability. And you even use the examples of Lovecraft and Ligotti to explain the difference between like Deleuze and Schelling and what they're thinking of life is like. Deleuze being a kind of Ligottian idealist and Schelling being some kind of Lovecraftian materialist. But I think if there's a horror story that I think like perfectly expresses Deleuze's metaphysics, well, it might be Ligotti's Nyctalops trilogy, which I think is a really succinct articulation of this idea that we don't need to go elsewhere. We don't need to find some dark Ungrund to discover the putrid mysteries of nature. The world as it is already less familiar than we think it is. But the horror story that I think is especially salient for articulating Deleuze's metaphysics is Edgar Allan Poe's The Imp of the Obscene.
Yeah.
Where you have this man who sort of reads these articles in various newspapers about like someone falling from a blimp and all these various obscene stories. And he thinks that can't possibly be real. The world in which we live isn't so obscene. But then he gets visited by this imp, the imp of the obscene, who leads him in this adventure, which ends up with him like falling through a chimney and landing on a pig or something. So I guess in Deleuze, I almost see an immanentization of what Schelling wants to say about this dark vitalism, as you term it. It's not that it's unknowable, but it's that it's eminently knowable. The world as we exist within it, as we inhabit it, is already horrifying if we are willing to honestly confront it and open ourselves to the world that's before us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And you get to this issue about the stances, kind of this relation between stance and how the world is. And I think a lot of it is, I should say also, like Deleuze and Guattari were like my first philosophy love. They were the first people who I read everything, and it was sort of through reading them that I realized I wanted to do philosophy. Like I remember, I think I got out every secondary book on Deleuze from my library and put it in my bike basket. And I unlocked my bike, and my bike just immediately fell over. And that was the moment I'm like, oh, maybe this is what I should do. So I have like a real fondness for Deleuze and Guattari. So I don't, there's people you critique because you sort of love them, and people you don't ever want to read them again. And of course it's very different. But I think one of the things that struck me was, I don't know if we mentioned this when we talked before, that, and this Ian Hamilton Grant, and he gave a talk once where he said that he was also very much into Deleuze. And then at one point he thought that Deleuze was a Fichtean. Right? He gave this talk where he says Deleuze is really like the heir of Fichte. And everybody in the audience like gasped, like audibly. Like you can hear it. The recording's online somewhere.
But Deleuze says that he's very open about it. Like in What is Grounding, his 1956 lecture series, he's totally open about the influence of Fichte on his ideas.
But I think the issue then is if you it's a bit then if you say, okay, yeah, this Lagodian thing, everything is kind of horrible if it's a bit askew in the right way, or you can sort of see how things are off. I think the test between the kind of Fichte and the Schellingian position is, it seems like, and I would say this is true for Deleuze, it seems like there's a point where there's always, in the last instance, some kind of minimum safe distance. It's like the fact that you can recognize like iffiness of things in some very small way allows you to like know what's about to happen to you. I mean, maybe that's debatable, but it almost seems like there's a capacity for action in Deleuze that like it always seems like there's an escape hatch, I would say, in Deleuze. And I think of this also like his reading about the short text he has on, I don't remember the name of the story. It's about the alcoholic, about drunkenness. Is it Steinbeck's story?
I'm not sure. I remember he talks about it a lot in The Logic of Sense.
Yeah, there's this, and I think there's also a separate, I'd say maybe, but it's kind of a similar thing. It's like the crack. He's talking about the crack and the break.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's this kind of sense of like explaining the kind of experience of these kinds of habits or pathologies or whatever you want to call them. And there's often this sense that you can that there's always some way out. Like you can always recode in the last instance. You can always sort of twist things in a way that somehow you, and I guess this is part of the issue, I think there's a you that survives every encounter at Deleuze, even if it's only a probe head version of yourself or whatever. Whereas I feel like in Schelling, it's not always the case. And I mean, the Lovecraft analogy might not be the best because I think this unprethinkability, right? This fact that no matter how far back you go or how much ungrounding you do or how much thinking about the past you do, there's always going to be something left, right? And this is also this indivisible remainder kind of logic. It's like there's something you're not going to get to, which means your safety is never guaranteed in the last instance. So that's what I mean a bit by the rosiness. It's not rosiness, it's putting it too extremely. But I feel like there's a minimal safe distance in Deleuze that isn't there in Schelling. And I think it's something very powerful about this. And I think also that aspect of Deleuze's Fichteanism, if you can say that, is also very manifest in Meillas's work, right? Like the power of thought, right? Kind of is always there, right? Like the correlation, sort of us being related to the world in preconditioned ways, there's a certain way of thinking, right, which for him is largely mathematical, but like there's a way to think the absolute that is always something that we are capable of doing. And I feel like that's a kind of, it's almost like the inverted image of this sort of tiny bit of the self that is somehow preserved. But again, my Deleuze is much more rusty than yours, and I'm sure that I could be convinced otherwise. But
Well, I just want to jump in here. I mean, I think there are some texts with Deleuze that we could look at to push back against this, like the method of dramatization. I think that's one that maybe poses a bit of a challenge to this, but that's, at this point, I think a conversation for another time. We're nearing up on the hour mark. So I was wondering if, just as we close, you wanted to have offer us any final comments, if you wanted to talk to us about your current projects. I know you've got 3 books on the go. Could you possibly tell us about those?
well, it's on science fiction and colonialism. That's a sort of short book, like a sort of 100-page kind of book, which, might be coming out with Zer0. I don't know yet. So we'll see. But that sort of does readings of a lot of non-Western science fiction, and this whole issue of, it's sort of on the theme of inhabitation, right? This idea that this colonial mindset of like, no one is here, right? And sort of how that plays in different science fiction films, right? Like about an uninhabited planet, right? This kind of notion, and how this plays into the history of colonialism, and also how science fiction and colonialism has fed back into each other. So it's just sort of 5 short chapters of that. And then, I mean, the sort of big book project, which I have no idea how long it will take, is to do a sort of history of idealism in biology. So to look at how, the title is Bloodless, is the title. But this idea of like how abstractions manifest themselves in biological research. So in terms of like the perfect form, or early on, or to like how morphology was thought as a sort of more than biological, but biologically manifested thing. I mean, there's all kinds of strains of this, right? Like the model organism, the different ways in which their kind of abstraction plays in the history of biology, or the ideal populations, all these things. But that's like 200 years of material, basically. So it's like a lot of, I still have to do some reading for that. But then the third, I am blanking. Do I have a third book? I feel like, because it depends what you count as book, I guess.
I thought I remembered seeing on your blog, you said you're working on 3 projects right now, but I might be misremembering them.
No, I could. You're probably right. I think it's probably when it's last time updated also, because I wrote this habilitation, this sort of secondary PhD on British idealism, but that's sort of done and nobody cares about British idealism. Anyway. Oh yeah, sorry. No, yeah, there is the other one. Sorry. You're right. Of course. It's a collection of texts I've written, more texts, which is about the relationship between Schelling and 20th century French thought. And so that's kind of like Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, Gilles-Châtelet, all the figures who have kind of referenced Schelling to some implicitly and some more explicitly. And it focuses a lot on like how nature, if you see nature itself as formalizing itself. So there's a lot of talk about the diagram, the sign, the sort of Peirce, and of sort of French rationalism being kind of undermined by Schelling, and how this plays into the kind of chemical and experimental sciences of the time, this kind of thing. But yeah, that one's done, but I need to find a home for it. And I think it's kind of hard to find one that's, a home where the book doesn't end up costing $110, I guess I should say. So not some of the usual suspects. Anyways.
Sure. Well, again, I think that's just about all we have time for. I'm sure Adam and I will be expecting signed copies of those books in the mail once they're out.
Come on.
If it's not 100, I'll buy the British idealism and all the Schelling ones I could possibly get my hands on, because F.H. Bradley, he's going to have a revival. I'm sensing it. Schelling is coming back. Bradley's coming back.
I would love to see the day, but I wouldn't hold that.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us today, Ben. It's been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.